Great. So, start the recording. Hello, everyone. Would like to welcome Deepa Narayan, the great author of this wonderful book. Just wanted to introduce her first. She released a book recently called Chup, Breaking the Silence About India's Women. The book is very disturbing and troubling, but it's also revolutionary at the same time. Deepa Narayan has been working with the World Bank for many years, is a social scientist, and I am the lucky one to ask her a few questions. And thank you, Deepa, for sparing your time. I know you're busy talking to a lot of journalists and a lot of, in a lot of panels. So I'm grateful that I have some time from you. Thanks, Deepa. So just
Thanks,
wanted to
Radhika. Pleasure.
I wanted to ask you first about the idea on how you came up with the idea. I know you've written a few lines about your inception and your idea about the book, but just wanted to get a sense from you for a wider audience to see how you came up with the idea for the book.
Actually, it happened very organically. It was an accidental book. I had no intention of doing more research or write more books because I'd written 17 books. And so I thought that's enough. After the Nirbhaya rape in 2012, I started asking myself, what can I do to contribute towards deeper understanding on why these things happen? And being a cultural psychologist, I thought I would explore more the cultural issue. What is it in our culture that leads to devaluing of women and abuse and everyday sexism? And if there's anything we can explore or understand. So I came up with a very simple question, which I think is the foundation stone of societies, which is what does it mean to be a good woman or a good man today? And when I was asked to give a talk on poverty and development at St. Stephen's College in Delhi, which is one of the most elite and premier colleges, I said I would come if I could talk about, explore gender issues with the students, which is what I did. I had them write their responses to the question, what does it mean to you to be a good woman or a good man today? And I was so surprised by their answers, which seemed to be at least 50, 100 years old, that I decided to go to one more school and one more college and one more college. And that's how it started, because what I was hearing was full of surprises. And I felt there was something here that needed to be probed more deeply and more systematically. That's what led to a large research project without my realizing it.
Wow, fascinating. So usually I find books on, the marginalized. It's always the other women who are always very deprived and who are like, we are looking at marginalized in terms of many different ways,
Hmm.
be it caste or be it economic marginalization. But here was a book which was actually about me. It was about, people like me who are in the same scenario, but we never thought of us. It was always for me, it was like, okay, this is how it is.
Hmm.
Two
Exactly.
parts. So, how did you come up with this idea of it was about everyone in general, all women in India?
Well, when I started off, given my background in poverty, I obviously, and as a researcher, I sliced society into quintiles and I said, okay, I'm going to do 20% very poor, 20% above that, etc. But one night I was listening to a TV show which was being run by Barkha Dutt. And the men and even the women on that panel were saying that basically modern women are free and independent and they don't have any problems in terms of empowerment. And I thought that was so far from what I was finding that I decided that if I included poor women in this report or in this book, it would give an out to the middle class and not break their denial. So I've been criticized for not including the poor. I actually talked to about 3,000 women in rural areas, as well as poor women in the cities, but I did not include them because I did not want us to have any excuse to go into denial again about what was happening in our own families, in our own classes, because we are the ones who are more educated, who are not living hand to mouth, who are not in acute poverty, who have the luxury of being able to work on broader issues that we care about.
Mhm. Thanks. My next question is around this idea of feminist studies or feminism. Usually, we talk of feminism in a much more theoretical way, in a much more it's more like a theoretical base for our work. But was a book which actually talk about how feminism was reflected or not reflected in terms of behaviors.
Mhm.
So, just wanted to see and understand from you in terms of your theoretical underpinnings. Was there any feminist literature that you looked at which helped you to focus the way the book is focused right now?
Not really. No. I'm a researcher who starts by putting assumptions aside. And I think literature reviews fill you with ideas and preconceptions about what you should find. And I wanted to go on an exploration, very much like Voices of the Poor, where to understand and to learn from women as well as men what their everyday lived experiences were like. So it was after I found these habits, I sort of organized the data into habits, that it was in the much later stages that I looked at the literature to see where there was collaboration, where there was corroboration, where there were differences, rather than starting with the literature. So
Mhm,
it's not a book about women's rights or shoulds. It's about how women actually, especially the educated middle classes, on whom there's very little primary data,
mhm,
particularly in India, how women behave in their everyday lives
mhm,
despite their intellectual beliefs, and how men behave towards women and carry out their lives
mhm,
despite their intellectual beliefs. Everyone now believes, at least the women and men I spoke to, which are the educated women and men in Delhi and the other big metros in India, everyone now believes in gender equality. Right.
mhm,
So,
mhm,
really, what the study reveals is the gap between intellectual beliefs and everyday behavior.
mhm. So this behavior related fact, Deepa, I think it's very fascinating because usually psychologists would deal with behaviors. A social scientist dealing with behaviors and keeping the culture aside and keeping all the other, like the intellectualism aside, keeping feminist beliefs, rights aside, must have been very hard for you.
Actually, no, that part wasn't hard. What was difficult is making sense of all the behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
How does it fit? And then looking for how does it fit theory, or does it, or is there a concept that goes beyond or underneath patriarchy that helps explain these very disparate behaviors. I think that was the very difficult part because I had ended up with 1,800 hours of listening, 8,000 pages of notes. It's inductive research, it's very detailed interviews that go on for 3 to 4 hours, following what women want to talk about beyond a general set of questions that I had and that I trained other women and men to ask. So it was I see my job as pattern detection.
Mm-hmm.
So it was trying to discern what are the patterns emerge in this. And I think the turning point for me was the day I realized that what these behaviors were about training women not to exist.
Mm-hmm.
That is the key new concept or the new idea of the book, that if you go beyond patriarchy, and by that I mean patriarchy is important and has helped explain gender inequality, but it's become so overused that it's become a conversation stopper rather than a conversation starter. And my book is motivated by wanting to bring about change.
Mm-hmm.
And to bring about change, we have to sort of unpack what is actually happening, but have one idea or concept that helps link together behaviors that seem harmless. And I think that's sort of the beauty of staying behavioral. And behavior is an aspect, is a manifestation of culture. So it is a cultural analysis, but focusing on behavior as the manifestation of culture. or a culture of inequality, or a culture which basically says that girls should not exist. So one way of girls not existing is by killing them off, which is a crude way, but the other way is saying minimizing their existence. How do you minimize a girl's existence so she becomes sort of invisible even when she is visible, physically visible?
Mhm, mhm. So you basically are saying that patriarchy is a conversation stopper. In the sense, I just wanted to understand it more, in a better way. Are you saying that whatever assumptions that we have for girls, we would just say, oh, it's because of patriarchy. So it's always the male dominant thing, and like that's why it's a conversation stopper. Not realizing that maybe we have trained ourselves to be invisible, and we have trained ourselves not to exist, or is that
Right. No, that basically we don't unpack it more. It doesn't lead to actions to intervene both in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in institutions, in the rules of the game.
Mhm,
So, I mean, I think patriarchy has has helped us all these years, but I think we need something that helps us dig in and gives us points of intervention, whether it's in education or in preschool education or in looking at a large organization like the UN or the World Bank or governments.
mhm,
How our government whether how a ministry functions, does it include women, does it exclude women, does it make women invisible at the institutional level, and then also looking at it through the policy lens.
mhm, mhm. So when you were doing these interviews, Deepa, like 600 interviews or more, and did you start figuring out these patterns much earlier on, like maybe after the 10, 15, maybe 50 interviews, the patterns were clear, or did you find
No.
no?
I wish they were clear. No, they weren't. I think people ask me what surprised you. I think just about everything surprised me. But I think one of the biggest surprises, because this was a question earlier on, was on the body. So it was not a study that looked at abuse or to understand rape or anything like that directly. Looking at there was one question that focused on eve teasing. In India, we call sexual molestation eve teasing, which is a disguise in itself, cultural disguise. And when we asked that question, women stories just poured out. And this was just one question out of, say, 50 questions. And based on the women I spoke to and based on talks that I've given since, when I ask an auditorium full of women, raise your hands if you've never been molested or touched inappropriately, just about nobody raises their hands. So it's a very pervasive problem, but we normalized it. We'd all thought, कि ये तो सबको होता है. This happens to everyone. So, and you're not supposed to talk about it.
Yeah.
But why? Right? That's part of making women invisible and disowning their bodies and not being comfortable with their bodies. And if you're not comfortable with your own body, the metaphor I use, it's like rejecting the only house you have,
Mm, mm,
which
yeah.
leads to a lifetime of lack of confidence and not being sure of who you are or who you should be or who you want to be or
Mm-hmm,
who it's safe to be.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So it's the search for safety, psychological safety,
mm-hmm,
that gets very messed up.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. I get so engrossed with your interesting conversation that I forget to see where my questions are. This is also very intriguing. My next question was around the interviews. Deepa, you mentioned that there are these that women poured a lot of it's a lot of rich data, and it's also very surprising to me that women who are just pouring out their really inhibitions and their really inner self to enumerator. So I don't know how you manage to elicit all this information from women, especially on a topic that's so sensitive and so taboo in India.
Actually, the answer is very simple. That is, we created a safe environment by being non judgmental. And the fact that we were strangers most of the time, but I interviewed a lot of friends as well initially to get a sense of what was happening. I think when women feel safe and heard, then they start talking. In the same way as probably as men, although men are usually not as good talkers. It was this psychological safety. And it was strangers, including people in cafes, outside colleges. I remember I interviewed one woman out, she'd just finished her PhD chemistry exam.
Yeah.
And she came in a lab coat, and we were sitting in the hallway in one corner, and she just spoke for 2.5 hours and started crying. And I was very apologetic because I didn't know her, and she just finished a major hurdle. And she thanked me for listening
Mm-hmm.
so that she could pour her story out. So it's sort of catharsis in some way. Um, and the other thing that I've learned from doing workshops now with women and men is on what does it mean to be a man, exploring these issues. And when I ask women and men what have they learned, one of the things that comes out consistently is that they say, I didn't realize I didn't listen before, that I wasn't a good listener.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're always intervening with advice,
Mm-hmm. I
or
see.
our response, our
Mm-hmm.
comeback. And so we don't really listen. So I think women just felt listened to and not judged. And so they felt safe to share their innermost secrets. We didn't ask for secrets. We didn't ask for, tell me about your sexual life. It just kept pouring out.
Mm-hmm. So why India and why not any other country? Do you think that India holds a special place because um, I feel that we are at this brink of there is modernity, but there are also traditional values. Then there are also things that are happening to women in terms of, they are getting more independence, and there's all this newfound independence. More women are educated, they're traveling to cities alone. Why did you pick India?
It was partially because it was I wanted to follow up after the Nirbhaya rape to understand the culture. If you're focusing on a culture, culture is specific. And so I didn't want to mess it up by trying to do a cross cultural study or an American Indian comparison. That would have been relatively easy. But I really wanted to, I assumed I didn't know anything. And I wanted to plunge into the depths of the culture.
Mhm,
In
mhm,
fact, I found the stories. I mean, after writing, it seemed simple, but it wasn't simple. Um, I actually interviewed men as well. The intention was to interview men and women, but I found women's stories so complex and surprising that after interviewing 50 men, I stopped interviewing men because I didn't feel I could do justice
mhm,
to such different realities.
mhm,
So it was also India because, it's 650 million women.
mhm,
And that's a huge number. And we're all taken in by the changes on the outside. We've gotten distracted. So we talk a lot about gender equality and gender empowerment, etc. But then, why do we see the numbers that we do, which is 11% of women as CEOs,
yeah,
very low numbers, 11% in parliament, um, women not getting money in as investments for startup businesses. And just because women are more educated doesn't mean that the world of fairness or unfairness has changed. So
mhm,
I didn't know what was happening. So really, I wanted to explore what was happening to see if there would be any new insights
mhm,
that would take us further along in terms of change and design of interventions, policies, as well as large scale programs.
mhm. Thanks, Deepa. So I think one big takeaway from the book for me was that we have to look at these nuanced behaviors, and we have to not just look at the external things that you're just suggesting, that okay, CEOs and other things. It is this suppression is everywhere in our daily lives and day to day work. But so, in terms of the policymakers, if this problem is so widespread and we are feeling it every day, what do we, I mean, just wanted to get a sense from you in terms of your message for a policymaker. How should they start beginning to think about gender suppression?
I think we're all cultural creatures. Every policymaker is a product of a particular policy. of a particular cultural environment. Every culture is biased against women. We see this in the US and we see it in India. So rather than shaming, why don't we assume that every institution, every policy, every organization is gender biased? And that gender bias is like cultural dirt that needs to be swept away. I mean, we clean our office every day. We don't make a big deal of it, right? You just sweep it. You don't say, oh my God, this is really dirty. You just clean it. So, in the same way, let's just look at every organization and institution, assume it's culture biased, and together as men and women, like cultural detectives, look at what's biased in here and what needs to be changed and get on with it rather than getting into the game of blaming and shaming and everything else that we do.
Mhm.
Because where there's blame and shame, there's suppression and
Mhm.
nothing changes.
Yeah.
Where you give men and women some space for creativity and put their ideas in place on how do we make this gender equal or gender equal so that both men and women flourish, then I think the creativity blossoms and everyone has ownership of the change.
Mhm. Thanks, Deepa. This is very, very useful. And then one last bit on us. What do we do as girls in terms of changing our own patterns and behaviors? One thing that's very clear to at least me when I read your book is be observant about your posture, be observant about the things that and get these signs. It's not like big things that will come your way which will suppress you. It's also your day to day lives that we need to be much more cognizant about. But from your end, what message do you want to give to
I've struggled to change on my own, and when I look back at my life, I think the times where I got the most courage was when I worked with other women. So every woman thinks she's alone. And so it's important to reach out to friends, to others, and be vulnerable because it's the support that makes it easier and actually more fun to change. Because then you can laugh every time you fail or make the same mistake rather than pull yourself down and judge yourself. So I think women solidarity groups, networks, etc., reaching out for support rather than hiding and thinking you're the only one with these problems is very important. I think the second thing that's important is to realize that our behaviors are not a personal defect. We're not personally defective. We have been trained to be this way because it serves society. And so the moment you take that judgment off, that it's in an impersonal sense, it's not my fault. I was trained to be this way. That immediately lightens the load rather than, oh my God, it's shameful to be like this. So then the shame is the dominant feeling rather than lightness to change. Hey, I could change. So these are all habits that have been learned, that have been trained, that have been sort of drilled into us,
Mhm.
and we can change a habit.
Great. That is a very promising note to end this very fascinating interview. Thank you, Deepa Narayan, for sharing your insights of the book. Your book is truly fascinating and very, very revolutionary. I just wanted to just wanted to read the title again so that everyone goes and reads the book. It's Chup, Breaking the Silence About India's Women. I think it is creating a lot of ripples and it has given us a lot of food for thought. I've had many discussions and it's a pleasure to actually interview the author of the book. So thank you, Deepa, for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Radhika. It's
Thank
been
you.
wonderful to talk to you. Good luck.
Thank you.